So why don't we why don't we just start quickly by the small group of us, Dave and Jeff and I, um, selected to start pulling together a report outline and recommendations and fill in as many blanks as we could. And before, so we pulled together like an outline sort of similar to that presentation that we did for the public meeting as the basis of that, with the idea that before we agree on a final structure, we needed to understand the framework of the recommendations so that we could then make the report lead to the recommendation, whatever. So we wanted to start figuring out where we were going so we could figure out how to get there. So we had talked through several items and decided before we got too far, we wanted to make sure we had enough information to make reasonable, realistic recommendations, and also to make sure that we could, along the process of doing this, get enough support, so that when we're, wherever we get to, we'd have support by the time we got there. So decided to speak with the mayor, because we hadn't officially spoken with him, although he came and talked at that first public meeting. And we wanted to chat with Dave Conti. So that call is going to be next week. And so Jeff and Sue Ellen and I and Dave Moore, the mayor invited us to chat with him. So he spent like an hour with us, which was great. And we had we did sort of a presentation. We talked about, sort of how the committee was put together, how we got where we got, and that we were thinking about some specific areas to think through recommendations. And those areas were, trying to think through long-term protection of the reservoir, think about how a construct of Yoni's here, how to think through the construct of having there be like an area master plan, how to look at the areas of the reservoir and all the other pieces together, and then think through what issues of access might mean, and then issues related to enhanced recreation, because those were the things that we heard most people comment on at the public meeting. So those were sort of our big areas for talking through those with the mayor to see where he was. And I thought he was pretty forthcoming. Jeff, did you want to mention what he talked about with us, or?
Sure. I'll talk about it. Wow, it's echoing a little bit there. Can you guys hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay. So as Marlene pointed out, we had like 5 issues we laid out for him, and we went through the charge and purpose and those kind of things. And we didn't spend a lot of time on the public access piece, and we didn't spend a lot of time on the enhanced recreation, although we talked about those things. Dave mentioned, for instance, that 263 acres is not, there are limitations to what you can do on property that size. We did really we wanted to feel the mayor out a little bit, related to a couple of the issues. I think the long-term protection options, where the mayor kind of stood on that, was one area we just wanted to see if this was something that he supported. Again, our committee hasn't even agreed on recommendations. So we're aware of that. And we made that pretty clear. I will say we made that pretty clear to the mayor. These are just things we found in the process. We haven't agreed on recommendations. So we wanted to get his feel for that. And he seemed to be supportive. He kind of opened up with he kind of opened up with 4 things. He said he thought preservation, protection, accessibility, and limit development to 0. Those were the things I wrote down that he said right off the bat. And so that's important. But he also was very he was excited about the community access and beyond that, community engagement. With anything we do, he would like to find robust community involved engagement around the things that we want to do. So we laid out things like the long-term protection based on his his points he laid out. I think he would support that, and he listened carefully about that. The other things that we thought were that the mayor would kind of have to support if we move forward with, and that would be if we recommended something like a Northern Holyoke planning vision, right? And so that was one thing we laid out. And again, that's where I have in my notes, wow, this could be part of the updated master plan, and we could have robust community involved area plan for Northern Holyoke. So he seemed to like that idea. He also, I think, was interested in what we called kind of an area management plan. So if we brought together all the partners, to have a broader plan to work together, much like Eric Sewer had mentioned, said there used to be a group that got together. And the other thing that we learned when we talked further with Jennifer Howard was the conservation restrictions for Bear Hole, the similar kind of analogous situation in West Springfield, had a management plan as part of that conservation restriction. And so that could serve as the way to work with some of the partners in the area. So we discussed that, and those things, I think the mayor was, supportive of. But again, we talked broadly. And so we also, I'll remind everyone again, we told him we haven't agreed on recommendations, but we wanted to see his level of support. And so I'm glad Yoni has joined us, because what the mayor in turn said about those last two pieces, about a North Holyoke planning vision and about, maybe an area management plan. He said, do you guys have a budget? How are you getting
work done? Who's writing this report?
Right. How are you going to do this? And so we said, no, of course we don't. And he said, well, that he was aware that the MVP, the mass vulnerability preparedness grants are going to be due relatively soon. They have to make decisions on it. And so this ought to be considered, at least when they're thinking about whether it was worth consideration for putting in for a grant. And Yoni and I have talked about this a little bit, but we haven't even articulated what each one of these pieces would be. So it's hard at this point to make a decision, but that was the discussion. So I think so I'll leave it there.
Yeah. So
hey, Marlene, before you go on, I was going to ask Kate, and Yoni can move in on this too. So the mayor mentioned the updated master planning effort, and he mentioned it for the whole city. Are you guys aware of this? Is there a time schedule for this? Is Aaron already moving on this?
No.
I don't know anything about that happening as a member of the planning board.
Yeah, same. It's definitely been discussed, and it might be something that occurs in different stages, the different elements, but I don't think there's a process in mind yet. And it might come from the advisory committees that are just now starting to get put together as well.
Yeah, and I do have in my notes his kind of thought that this would begin to engage this process within a year. And he had another funding source for that, which, I'm not going to say what that was, but it was different than the grant funding, Yoni, that we talked about. So at any rate, So it was a very positive meeting with the
It
he
was
seemed
a
like
positive discussion. But, before we go happily, and we did, as Jeff mentioned, we did do some additional catch up with Jennifer Howard so that we understood more specifically what the requirements might be with respect to long-term protection, how does that work, and, who gets engaged and what, because before we talk further with Dave Conti from Water Department, we want to make sure we understood more specifically what the framing of the CR process might be or is from a statewide perspective, and how those things get worked around, so we understand the things that the state will need or want, and how that might work with whatever the water department wants to do or doesn't want to do. But we just wanted to be better informed of all those things, so we caught up with her briefly as well.
and she also shared with us the CR of Bear Hole, which, so it was really helpful to look at that. And it was really helpful, I think, for Dave Moore to look at that and talk to Dave Conti. And Dave Moore's thoughts were that, there was nothing in there that Dave Conti couldn't live with, although we all recognize there would be hoops that they would have to jump through. They would have an audit every 2 years or so, so there are things that, they would have to deal with, but it would also come with the benefit of some long-term vision and a long-term management component and long-term protection. So you don't have to constantly fight a flanking maneuver, somebody messing around with, what's going to happen with the reservoir.
And money too.
So I put together, based on all the things that we've been thinking about, we took those, sort of general areas, and we thought that collective, we should start thinking about recommendations and discussing them with everybody before we, get too far down the road here. I'm happy to put this stuff up on the screen that I sent on an email to the people earlier today, if that makes sense.
I think it makes sense. I guess I do have a question. If folks did have a chance to look at kind of the outline that we had put together for the report earlier, and again, it was kind of, we just pasted a bunch of stuff in there, and so it could not have been easy to read, and it wasn't intended for that, but it was intended to give a feeling for what the document might contain. So if you guys had thoughts, that might also be helpful.
So on the screen, the items on top were sort of the things we chatted about with the mayor, but the general areas for recommendations that we were thinking of were in the areas of long-term protection, improved public access, promoting and enhancing recreation, the notion of a area-wide management plan for North Holyoke, and then, how does this fit in with an overall Holyoke master plan strategy that the mayor is interested in initiating at some point.
Just a question for you guys too, while you're looking at that. Marlene asked me, when we put these kind of broad areas together, was there anything missing? And for instance, we didn't have that area-wide management plan on there, so we added that. Are there other kind of broad areas that were kind of focus areas of discussion that we didn't address here? I will say, kind of community engagement needs to be a theme that runs through all this, and also underserved communities, and somehow we need to get that in here so we don't miss it. But
I can put this, so under more opportunity for community access, that's that was where, that's what I was thinking, but we should definitely expand on that, because the idea that we have these great resources in Holyoke and not everybody knows about them, is able to access them, and access isn't particularly easy. We wanted to make sure that we were vigilant about promoting access here.
So are you going to try to capture stuff here, Marlene, or do you want me
Yeah.
to try to capture it elsewhere?
I'm
So it
trying to
just
figure
seems-
out.
It just seems like, right. So it seems like it would be nice to have another bullet that said, enhance community engagement and outreach to underserved communities, or what, maybe there's a better term for that. But just so we don't lose those two pieces, Kate, maybe you have a better way to state that.
Are you looking at this while I'm doing this?
Yep, can see it. That's great.
Okay, enhance community access for underserved.
I would say to include underserved communities.
Okay,
Kate, is there a better way to say that?
I don't know. So now the 2 bullet points seem somewhat repetitive. I guess I'm thinking of a couple things. One is like reaching out so that everybody in Holyoke knows and has access. But the other piece, and maybe it's changing the first bullet point. I guess I'm thinking about like universal accessibility. That might be too big of an ask, but some
important. It's an important one. So let me ask you. I mean, this is something I've been thinking about in my head. Is community, listening to the mayor, and again, the mayor is just one person here, but is community outreach different? Is it a subset of improved public access, or is it a subset of enhancing recreation, or is it a separate box that we have to, is it a separate set of is it a separate area of recommendations that we need to have? That's all.
yeah,
I have another category of things that I'm thinking of, and I don't know if they go under one of these bullets or if it's different, but I guess I'm thinking about educational opportunities.
I mean, we do, there is educational opportunities on there under improved access.
Right. Okay. You're right. I see it now. One thing I was thinking in reading through a little bit more about the report PVPC sent and what's happening at the Fresh Pond Reservoir, which seems like the most exciting of the things that they showed us as comparisons. The fact that they've got like citizen science projects happening there, and especially that they have that public schools have basically a field station at the reservoir. It made me think about how I think it's made a substantial difference in Holyoke in terms of people's feelings about the river, that we have the fish lift and that so many kids from the schools go to the fish lift. And also then there's the fishing public access there. And it made me think, if kids from the schools were regularly going to Whiting Street for field research for science classes, and obviously Whiting Street wouldn't be the only possibility of places they could go, but if that became something that everybody did in, I don't know, 3rd grade, you can imagine that then we raise a generation of kids who really care about Whiting Street Reservoir.
Well, and maybe the idea, focusing that area-wide, to me, the notion of that area-wide management plan where all the abutters, all the pieces, so that Whiting Street isn't, the sole focus of that education program. But the I mean, someone could go to, Audubon, someone could go to the reservation, someone, whatever the program of the month is, it might be at a different spot, but it's all part of this overall area-wide education strategy that the reservoir is part of, but there's just more places to do it.
Yeah.
Hi, Kip. How are you?
Hey,
Kip
Kip.
should be here.
Sorry, I'm late.
That's okay. We're
No, thanks
chatting
for
about,
joining.
yeah. So we're thinking through some initial ideas for recommendations, and broad categories, so that everybody has a chance to, think through, add in, talk about some of these ideas. So that's what you're looking at.
So Marlene, can you add just to a way to solve what we were talking about earlier about the community engagement? Can you just cut and paste the enhanced community engagement and put it as part of the overarching title there where you have improved public access? Just add to that and enhance community engagement. In other words, you can leave the bullet down below, but just right. So that then it all fits. So Kip, we also briefed everyone on we had a brief meeting with the mayor. Well, it wasn't that brief. I mean, we had a good meeting with the mayor, and so we just went through that briefly.
Should there be a bullet point somewhere about possibilities for on-site management, like staff rangers? I know that we don't, that's not something we can have probably before the framework is set up, but that's a recommendation that we heard from people.
On-site staffing.
Yep.
And also at some point, maybe this is under enhance, promote recreation? I'm not sure. We definitely heard about the possibility of having another, the possibility of getting enhanced trailhead services if we link up with NET. I mean, something like having a rest area. I'm not sure that Holyoke Waterworks is going to want that. That might cause more trouble than it's worth, but it's certainly something worth considering.
Right. And if we had the area-wide management plan, it may
Right.
not have to even be on
Right.
waiting. So, one of the things, and we kind of said this before, but I'll say it again since Kip joined us late, we had kind of laid out recommendations in the form of issues, but we've never agreed on to them
Right.
as a committee. And so for us as a drafting subgroup, we felt like we had to come back to you guys and really try to flush out what would really be the recommendations. Like, does the committee support, this long-term protection, having a CR, a conservation restriction? Do they support, these things we're talking about under public access and enhanced community engagement? And how would we state those? So that's.
I mean, my feeling is that I'm supportive of all of this as long as it can be, positively negotiated with the waterworks, because of course the conservation of the water has to be primary. But if that can be done, then all of these things sound great.
Yeah. Agreed. I think that long-term protection was sort of the overarching, that seemed to be the first general area that we, wanted to, that we heard from the community members that participated in the meetings, and based on everything that we all had discussed, that seemed to be one of the primary places we were starting.
Yeah, and I think it's great that comes first as a recommendation. But it kind of, in my mind, it controls all the rest of the recommendations.
We're not calling out a conservation restriction though, specifically, in what I'm scanning here quickly. Am I missing something or?
Nope. We did not. That's, we talked to, it certainly can be a recommendation. What I think, we're going to be talking to Dave Conti on Tuesday in the afternoon. And the idea of trying to construct this in a way that by the time we get that as a final, before we get to that as a definitive recommendation, we want to make sure we can figure out how to have Waterworks be supportive of that. So we don't just do something and it goes away. We want to make sure that we can explain enough of what we heard from Jennifer Howard to make the Waterworks people not uncomfortable with us doing that, I guess was what we were thinking of, Kate.
Yeah, and let me add to that. So Kip, as you heard, I'm sorry, as you heard in the public meeting, there was a lot of questions about long-term protection and how and whether that was in place, and indeed was the reservoir going to be protected. And so my personal view is that and what was said by Jennifer Howard, and what indeed was said by the mayor, was this would be a strong statement by the city, and a point to indicate that the city intends to protect the reservoir, in the long term. So that's what a conservation restriction would do, as long as we can live with what's in the restrictions. And we got the bare whole conservation. Jennifer Howard sent us the actual document, the conservation restriction, and we looked at it pretty carefully. And we're going to share that with Dave Conti to make sure they can live with it. And if they can, it would be at the drafting team's suggestion that be a recommendation. But again, the committee has to agree with that. And that's the kind of guidance we need. I think hearing everything I've heard, that is what we should recommend. It's a very concrete thing. We can show examples of it. We can talk about the whatever $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 that it might bring. And again, it shows the long-term vision. But we haven't agreed to that. That's one thing. It's not a general statement anymore. It's a very specific recommendation. And as Kate pointed out, it kind of is the linchpin for everything that follows.
So might I suggest language, at least as a placeholder at this point, that maybe is consideration of a conservation restriction? Limit development, protect, I don't know where to put it there, but there, another bullet. Just as a placeholder and something that kind of threads the needle, right? We're not telling them they should do this. We're suggesting that the city consider a conservation restriction, because it does, yes. I think one of the charges was to
Llewellyn's here.
look at the economics of it, right? As there are ways to generate revenues. And this is like the kill two birds with one stone. You get long-term protection that's significantly more formal than what's there now, but also can get paid. So that's all. That's my suggestion.
Hey, Sue Ellen,
Hi. Sorry I'm late.
how are you? You doing
Okay.
okay?
A little tired. Okay.
Got it. Understood. So we're, what everybody's reacting to, I put on screen sort of the general areas of recommendations that we've been talking about with some bullet points that people are filling in, some more specificity. And we do have that call with Dave Moore next week, or with Dave Conti next week.
I like Kip's suggestion. I think that if you find that Dave Conti is seeming amenable to pursuing that, I would maybe upgrade the word consider to pursue the option 4, or, you know, some kind of language like
Right.
that.
Got it. Other things that people see, that they like, or see that they don't, or think are missing, or if, did I word it okay, or any other?
You're doing fine.
Well, it seems to me that if the board for the water department will consider a conservation restriction, they can, within that restriction, limit development, and the restriction will protect the assets. So everything's done if they consider that.
Yep.
It's just a question for us on how specific we want to be. You know, Kip, you know, as you're stating it, you know, of course, everything we put in here, you know, just because we make a recommendation doesn't mean it's going to go anyplace, obviously. But I think, you know, the clearer we can be on what option, you know, we can lay out options, or we can be very specific on what we found and what we think would work best for the city moving forward, and try to lay that out in some detail. Because, you know, we're recommending having these kind of bins where we have a broader overall area. Then we're going to have a recommendation, and then we're going to have to flush it out. And so that's how we're thinking about it. Right now, we're just trying to nail down what the recommendation would be so we can flesh them out. But at any rate, so maybe I was just stating the obvious.
One of the things that I think we were asked to do was make those recommendations. They're looking for what our findings are. And to withhold anything, any recommendation would be an error on our part.
So I agree with that. But so Kip, are there concerns that you have that there may be, that by having the conservation? So what Jennifer Howard laid out and laid in front of us was a very significant negotiation process that happens when you create the CR. And so if there were, you know, there may be opportunities to put in there, you know, types of recreation, for instance, that we think might be important, or educational activities that we think might be important. Some of those may not be consistent, obviously, but we ought to talk about them if you have, you know, concerns about, you know, you think in the the conservation restrictions may not be consistent with some uses you think are appropriate, for instance, just so we can be, straightforward on this.
Well, again, let me throw in something I keep saying, which is a conservation restriction is always made between the property owner and the holder of the restriction,
Yep.
or the person who's paying, the entity that is paying for the restriction. And those restrictions are written by these two parties, and the parties have to agree on them, or there's no conservation restriction. But
Right.
again, whoever owns the property can make and choose what they want on that property as a restriction, or what they don't want. It's a cooperative document.
And hopefully, that we'll get to that discussion with Dave on Tuesday. And that understanding of the CR being something that's off over there, that the waterworks wouldn't have any say over, any notions like that would settle down if there are those concerns.
As I look at our list and I think about sort of the charge to the committee, my guess is that some of the folks who issued the initial charge to the committee were hoping that what we would come back with would be, for instance, like, we're proposing that we run a zip line program that would bring in X amount of dollar, that they were looking for specific money-making opportunities. Now, you could argue conversely, the conservation restriction is a specific money-making opportunity, but I don't think it was it's a different bullet point than the bullet points I think the makers of the order were expecting, which leads me to say, I'm pretty comfortable with this list we've got here, but would it be useful to also put in any specifics about, for instance, increases in passive recreation that we think are possible based on what we researched? I guess I agree that that's, if we're suggesting a conservation restriction, that's probably something the conservation restriction would be controlling in a way.
Well, when you stop to think about it, Kate, I can't think of any, and I hope somebody else can, but any passive recreation that is not already going on at the reservoir, except perhaps for some educational opportunities.
Well, I mean, specifics that we might think about, I don't know. I mean, we heard that there's, for instance, some mountain bike going on, but there, do we want to suggest that should become more codified in a way so that there aren't conflicts around new trails going in? That be done in a more open way so that everybody's comfortable with what's going on, both the bikers and the waterworks? Or is that something that is too, that we would really need? I guess maybe I'm saying we might suggest that is something that needs to be thought about, but that we don't have the answer for it.
Yep.
And maybe there are other things that rise to that level that might warrant a bullet point.
So I thought, yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think, Kate, your point earlier that some of these conditions, like for instance, if we were to do the conservation restriction, it then controls some of the things below it. And as Sue Ellen pointed out, any negotiation we have on what's said and what's restricted within that conservation restriction, should be consistent with the recommendations that we make. And then maybe that's carried out below in kind of the area-wide management plan that's with partners. And maybe, for instance, you work with DCR, and they have the mountain biking allowed on portions of their property, which may or may not be appropriate. The use of Mount Tom would allow for it, but the endangered species there may not. But at any rate, but I do think we ought to try to list the kind of, if we have specific recreational enhancements in mind, we should list them here and figure out how to address them if they may not be consistent with what might be in the CR. So Kip, if you have, thoughts on this, I've heard you mention fishing. I've heard you mention, could you use kayaks? Again, I think that the current managers of Holyoke Water Department probably aren't in favor of that, but it would be something. But I mean, if we're serious about that, it needs to be, we need to tease it out in here and discuss it.
So I think part of our charge, right, was to look at revenue generating opportunities. Does everybody agree with that? I mean, am I making that up, or was that, I think that was one of and we go back to zip lining, but zip lining, because there would be some fees paid from that. Could you generate some revenue renting canoes there? Probably a little bit. Could you do other things like, fishing? I mean, could you have could you rent bikes and canoes and fishing poles? Could you do those? I'm just thinking, I'm not saying I think these are good ideas, okay? I'm just trying to, think out loud of revenue generating first category recreational opportunities. Could you do cross-country skiing? Could you rent cross-country skis there? Could you do ice skating? I'm petrified of being out on lakes and ponds. So I fell through once, that was enough for me. So I'm not saying I think that, but just these types of ideas. And then I think the other kind of outside the recreational revenue generating opportunities that I think we discussed at some point, was there opportunities to, sell some water, right? Like the Wyckoff as an example. Could you sell water more directly to them, make it more affordable? Could you sell water to, like those companies that fill your pool with a tanker? Is there could you sit bulk sales of water? Now, I think that covers it. And again, I'm not lobbying that we should be doing these things. I just think that, if we start considering that, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think that part of our charge was to see whether there were revenue generating opportunities. I think that was basically the whole premise for that order, with a recognition that they were going to be spending big money improving the spillway. Was there some way to get creative and generate some additional revenues that would help to
Sure.
cover the cost of those improvements?
Sure. And, the thing that always pops in my head when, we talk about those is, well, we could generate some revenue, but there's going to be costs associated with staffing and setting them up and, having all that. So is there net revenue off of that?
Well, when I say revenue, I always mean net revenue. I never
Yeah.
think about
And,
losing.
and I don't know the answer to
And
net
I don't know
revenue.
the answer to any of these things either, you know. I guess let's just think about cross-country skiing. You know, if you bought a bunch of cross-country skis and had a a shed up there renting cross-country skis, you know, so far this winter it'd be pretty slim pickings on the revenue side of it. So
You could just make snow.
you could make snow with all the excess water that you have. And Dave Moore's probably got some snow guns hiding somewhere. No, I mean, you know, I don't want to get way off track. I just want to make the point that when I think about the charge, I do think that, you know, revenue generation.
So I made that a topic area
Okay, good. I
for
think,
us to
right.
have
Perfect.
on the list.
Perfect.
I guess I like having that as a separate topic. Marlene, when you list other recreational activities, I guess I'm nervous about listing anything that involves being on or in the water, because I think we've heard pretty clearly that that's not going to be acceptable. So I don't, you know, things, canoes and fishing and ice skating all sound to me like things that my personal feeling would be not to put those in there. Because I think that the only things we've heard of that Waterworks is going to be at all supportive of are off the water. And I also think that all of the things that are off the water are things that can be also addressed within the area-wide management plan in a way.
All
So-
right.
So where do you want to, so I mean, but this is an important discussion for us because
Yep.
First of all, just like we said about the mayor, the city council asked us, you know, we were a study committee. We were asked to look into this. We weren't asked to come back to the mayor and ask him his permission. We weren't asked to go to Dave Conti and ask for his permission on what we recommend. I think we need to be very aware of the circumstances in how we lay these things out. So with that said, and I think we have to agree on these things. I don't think we should put in here things that we don't agree with as a group. But for now, we haven't agreed on things. So I think we probably do need to be able to capture if people feel like Kip stated these things. So, you know, maybe it fits under generate, you know, consider, revenue generating items that were considered. I mean, maybe we put it there for now, but, and then we have to talk, but I think somewhere we have to talk about them as a group. And I was hoping, you know, we could do that tonight, but I think we're just getting the list together tonight. I don't think we're going to be able to agree.
All right. So I'm going to leave them on here so we can continue to react to them over the next.
Thanks. That's fine. Sorry to be long-winded.
That's okay. Got it. Harry, what do you think? You have been quiet.
Yeah, I've been quiet. I think, well, Dave Conti said that he obviously didn't want anything in that water. And I think the whole area, I mean, not just the reservoir itself, but the property is a small piece of property in relation to all these things that may exist in other places. And I also think that, you know, charging somebody to go fishing and or cross-country skiing, you know, we're not in that area where in the long run, I don't think it can make any money. And, you know, I think it's just kind of throwing money away. They had at one time at Wyckoff Country Club, an outfit that came in for cross-country skiing back in probably the 70s. And that lasted, I believe, just one season. And back then we had more snow than we have now. But to also, I mean, I'd love to have something cross-country skiing, but it's not going to, I don't think it can make any money. You know, the little bit that the golf courses have around here now, they let you go skiing. I know over in South Hadley at the Orchards, you can go skiing. They don't profess to recommend it, but they don't stop you from skiing. And some years you can do pretty well there, but to charge somebody to go skiing or to rent skis, that part of it I don't see happening. I like the idea of mountain biking though. But again, based upon the DCR and on Mount Tom, the groups got together, they don't allow mountain bikes. And I think that really started back when the group that was on the advisory committee up there were walking the trails, and some guys on mountain bikes were coming by. They said something and the biker said something else. And because the advisory committee ran the trails, mountain biking was outlawed. So I mean, and that's another conflict too. Biking on a hiking trail, if you've got something where you got a group of people that are looking at birds and and flora and fauna, and you got some bikers coming the other way, that could create a conflict too. So maybe you need different trails for different people, unless it's around the reservoir itself, that's a wide enough road that there's plenty of room for vision on both parties. The New England Trail, I've ridden my bike on that, and I guess it's okay. We never had any problems. So back to making money on any of this stuff, I don't see it making money. I think the CR is the best way to get some dollars in there, and you bank it and go forward with zip lining. I mean, a lot of places that even started zip lining are the ski areas, and they're making a comeback with that in the summertime. But just to have that as an opportunity to we'll come to the Whiting Street Reservoir and the site of Mount Tom and do some zip lining, I see that short-lived at best.
And I see all those things, Harry, as, you could do some of this stuff if you're talking about a whole area plan, of all the pieces collectively, that there's some way to do the, zip lining and the, all that stuff. But that would be more effective as a strategy of an overall area-wide plan, as opposed to, what does that mean for the Whiting Street Reservoir? It's on its own.
Yeah, you need a more than one attraction to bring people to make any money doing any of that. Be it a ski area or at one of the beaches on any of the coast, you can have different opportunities, but you can't have just one, because I don't see it happening is making any money.
Kate?
I think this is where the example, the Planning Commission folks kept mentioning the Greylock Glen and Adams. And I think that's where, when you start talking about an area-wide management plan, you might be able to start looking at something like that. But I guess I agree with just backing up what Harry was saying, basically.
Yeah.
If I may,
Yes,
I
you
think
may.
everybody's right. Kip is specifically right about the need, or the perceived need, to develop some sort of money-making plan. We're all right about the difficulties when you merge activities with each other. And I think what we were asked to do, I'm going to go back to this again, is make recommendations. And Jeff has said several times correctly that we need to flesh out those recommendations. And all the things that people have mentioned are part of fleshing out the recommendations. The recommendation for the reservoir, that it continue, because and if you look at Pioneer Valley Planning Commission and the materials they brought back to us, it's pretty clear that our reservoir is too small for any of the non-passive activities. A CR seems to be the best way to bring a few dollars in to the city. we have looked at various money-making things and recognized the fact that paying for rangers or police protection or whatever you want to call it, wardens, is expensive and would not be manageable with any one of these ideas for money-making, but that they could be incorporated in an area-wide plan. And I think that's where the recommendation needs to go. And that's what we need to polish and come up with. So I think everybody said something that's absolutely correct. It just needs to be pulled together. And the question becomes, how do you want to pull it together?
Don't all be quiet now, people.
I think Ellen just did it. So just rewind the tape, take down what she said, and it's pulled together.
Yep. So we got the CR and we have an area-wide plan to do the rest.
Yeah, and the CR, well, if you go back to enhanced passive recreation, maybe we're talking about education through signage rather than anything more expensive, but education through signage can be a great thing.
Yeah.
If it is done in a way that won't be vandalized.
So just a suggestion where we have revenue generating ideas is maybe to put the conservation restriction there also.
Got it.
Because I do think there's an interesting balance that's starting to come up here, right? Like you could go one or two ways. A simple observation. Do zip lining, do fishing, do canoe rentals, do cross country, do a whole bunch of little things that are gonna generate a little bit of money. But balance that against the revenue potential from the conservation restriction, which would likely prohibit all of those things. It's almost the recommendation is almost making itself, right? Like, yes, we've considered these things, right? And we haven't done a deep financial analysis of them, but we have considered them with with an eye towards net revenues, and there would probably be pretty skinny net revenues compared to the conservation restriction, which would prohibit many of these things likely prohibit many of these things we're talking about.
Well, I don't think we ought to say that, Kip, because we don't know what the, if anything, the water department would put into a conservation restriction. We know that there are conservation restrictions in areas where they're doing a lot of those less passive recreational things. So I don't think we can go ahead and say it, that it would prohibit those things.
You're probably right. I'm just,
I know you're thinking out loud.
well,
Me
yeah, I know
too.
I get in trouble for doing that too, but maybe we don't make the recommendation. Maybe it is, well, and that's what we're supposed to do, right? Is make a recommendation, and or do we, a recommendation is considered the balances between a conservation restriction and some of these other expanded recreational, but it's not just that, right? That's not the whole equation.
Right.
Because there is some value, I think, in perpetual protection of this property, which it's not now, right? I mean, it can be undone, what's there.
Correct.
It could be undone. And worst case scenario, right, it could get sold off for development. I don't think there's a risk of that happening, but, you know, so it isn't just, you know, what kind of revenue could you get from cross-country skiing versus a conservation restriction? I think it becomes also the desire for perpetual protection of that property. Is that something that the water department is
And that's,
supportive of?
hopefully that's going to be what we chat with, Dave Conti about next week.
That also brings up the point, what is the value of the reservoir to the future of Holyoke?
It's huge. It's huge.
And that might be the best way to state it.
Right.
Okay, wait a minute.
So Sue Ellen, are you think
Could you repeat that? What is the value of the reservoir to
to the
the
city of
future?
Holyoke?
of Holyoke, to the future needs of Holyoke.
So Sue Ellen, are you thinking about that as it being a functional as a water providing reservoir?
It might at someday go back to that.
Yep.
And
I would
And
say
by the way-
the value's in the water, I would say.
Yeah,
They're not making any more land with we can't do a quabbin anymore.
So,
You know,
so
oh, go ahead.
by the way, the conservation easement would retire the reservoir as a water supply, but the way that Bear Hole was written, that can easily be undone.
Correct.
So it's written into the agreement that, in other words, it could become, the land is long-term protected for the uses designated in the conservation restriction, right? But there's also provision, if there's a need for a
Right.
drinking water reservoir, that it can become that use
Again,
in the future. So they can, the protections remain in place, but the use would change. So just to make Sue Ellen's point, so it could, it both receives, long-term protection, as a public use, and but it could be used as a drinking water reservoir in the future. Just to make that point. The Kate stated this earlier. I just wanted to make, I do think it would be helpful to decide on, some of these key pieces, like, again, Kate called it a controlling, and Kip, you've mentioned that too, that, if you make the top recommendation that we recommend, that we enter into conservation restrictions for long-term protection of the reservoir, and to designate these certain needs. And we can even list those. We can list the recommendations that we have for passive uses. We can recommend, the types of access that we think should be there. We can recommend the type of forest management that might be appropriate there, and that would probably come right out of their existing plan. But it does become the controlling piece, and then it's further enhanced by an area-wide plan that some of these uses could be recommended for partners, like, so maybe I don't know, the beautiful quarry becomes the place for mountain biking. I don't think we'll suggest a jump there. However,
Around the
I'll
edge.
suggest it. No, just kidding.
question is, who do we want jumping? No, don't, I didn't say
yeah,
that.
don't go there.
don't go there. All right, so have I captured here, you guys? I mean, I tried in my,
So
what do you all think? Am I missing something on this list that would be a takeoff for a discussion somewhere that we haven't had yet?
well, there's a lot of things that are missing, I think, in the recreation. We haven't stated very much. In other words, we've said, hey, you know, these things that were mentioned here about mountain bikes, cross-country skiing, fishing, canoes, we know they're not like, you know, we know that the water department may have concerns about those, but we haven't flushed out the things, you know, how far we do want to go with enhancing recreation. We haven't even talked about things like benches and things like that that were suggested. You know, when you mention the educational opportunities, I mean, you know, if you're bringing third graders in there, you know, they probably need some place to go to the bathroom. They need, you know, is there, you know, so there are other considerations that have to go with that. Is it even appropriate to bring kids out to, if the access, if you have to walk a mile and a half in, you know, so there are things we have to consider along with that. That's,
Right.
I mean, you know, I agree with those recommendations. I just think that we need to spell them out more. And Dave had a whole series of things on recreation that I thought, but I don't.
Yeah, he did have something. I don't know where I put it.
Do we have something about parking? You said transportation. I can't see your whole screen, so it might be there. I just may be missing it.
Well,
Here, transportation, parking.
you know,
It's there now. So do we want to, I can send this list out to everybody. We do have, we were meeting on an every other week basis. You guys want to chat again in 2 weeks? And we'll, in the interim, have met with Dave Conti, and anybody has any different ideas, they can, you know, feel free to send them along. Add them to the list, send them, you know, do an email, whatever. I can add to the list, and we can, you know, maybe have a more informed discussion after we talk with Dave Conti next week, in 2 weeks. What do people think about that?
Okay.
That sounds
I
good.
think it's good.
And if the committee or the subcommittee is doing more drafting of this, you know, send it out and we can be prepared with more comments or even send in comments.
Okay.
Right. And, you know, if you guys have comments, you know, if you wanted to flush out one of the, you know, take one of these areas like enhance and promote recreation, and you really wanted to, you know, just flush it out to think about it, we'll
take all dive-ins.
Yeah, you know, in a comprehensive way, because that's what we're trying to think about, is how we would pull this together, and again, what controls it, so we can begin to shape it into something that makes sense instead of a bunch of disparate recommendations.
Anybody want to volunteer? All right. So we'll kind of talk through this. We'll go through the list. I'll send this revised list out to everybody. Expect an email tomorrow or Thursday. I'll set up a call for 2 weeks from now.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Also, I mean, I would say it's hard for me right on the spot to be like, oh yeah, I'll write this piece. But as you're starting to wade through it, if you're like, oh, I really think I want Kate to deal with this bullet point and Kip to deal with this bullet point and Harry to deal with this bullet point. I mean, I think I'm certainly amenable to an ask of,
Okay.
hey, would I do this one?
And I do think we're going to get there.
We will
You know,
get
right
there.
now, you know, right now we really want to flesh out these recommendations, but we also might ask people to, you know, flesh out certain paragraphs, in the report too. But yeah, if you have thoughts though on these specific recommendations, that would be helpful.
Okay,
Yeah, there is a lot there. There's a lot of points.
okay. Cool.
One thing I really want to caution about is I think we shouldn't get too involved with considering the conservation restriction idea, because it's something that we would have to recommend that the water department discuss with an appropriate holder of a conservation easement. And we would then put our recommendations under that. That we'd want to include, we think from what we have heard and understood should be included. And we should handle other things the same way. Recommend enhanced parking and access, and then list recommendations under that, or ways to approach that issue, and do the same thing for each of the basic recommendations that we make.
Makes sense.
I
And
think
this-
that's a, go ahead.
No, I'm just starting to look at this and try to think of a way to bring it together in parallel construction so that we can make recommendations and under what categories the recommendations should be made, and then sub-recommendations underneath that. For instance, if we had an area-wide management plan, we would recommend finding funding to staff such a plan.
Right.
That would be our number one, and then we'd have other.
So Ellen, so I agree with you, and I think when we started this list to talk to the mayor, we tried to make it in a logical order in which we would we'd first deal with the long-term protection, then we deal with the improved access, then we talk about what kind of recreation we're going to enhance, and then we talk about how you make all that happen through the broader area plan. And then that, look, none of this happens by itself. You have to think about a broader vision for the whole area. So we had thought about it, and how we would pull it together and step through it like that, but maybe it doesn't hold together. So again, and as Harry pointed out, there's a lot of stuff in here now. So,
Sure
it's
is.
hard to carry a lot of things, through an approach like that. But
Yeah, it's a great outline though, and it reminds us of everything that we've talked about. There's been so much.
Cool. All right, I'll set up a call for 2 weeks. I'll send this list out to everybody, and we'll reconnect on Feb 1st.
that sounds good. Thank you for pulling the outline together. Do you think, is our intent for the meeting in 2 weeks to really kind of try to nail down and finalize the recommendations? Is that what
Yeah,
we're hoping?
and some of that'll be driven by what we can do next week with Dave Conti.
Right.
All sounds good to me.
Okay, guys.
All right, everybody.
All right. Thanks to
Sorry I
all.
kept everybody long. Thank you very much.
Good night.
You
Sorry I
didn't
was
keep us long.
late.
Stay well.
Stay well is right.
Stay well,
Yes.
everybody. Be healthy.